Dr. Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about philosopher Immanuel Kant. This is episode 1, another reading from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So there's sort of two aspects. I hope that I get better at podcasting the more that I practice. I'm just an ordinary bloke, nothing special. And just from my reading, it's better to go in for a little bit deeper. You get a really fluffy understanding if you read about philosophers from textbooks. Really poor understanding if you read individual short articles on the internet. But if you read their direct works themselves, it can be actually mind-blowing to try and actually understand the context of it. So this is a good entry point for people who want to know a little bit more. So in episode 1, I'll cover a general introduction and his life. And sort of the surprising thing for me is the finding out about different theories of force. That was an interesting aspect. And also the sort of tough life this person had, or I think it was a tough life, working unpaid for many, many years, 15 years unpaid as a lecturer. But also the fact that he wrote these incredibly long-winded titled books. The titles go on and on and on, like the German words are long themselves, but you can imagine these very long titles. So it's important to understand. It's also very sort of sobering to understand the Christian birth of physics and science, and how Descartes was very Christian. Newton was also very Christian, all very interested in understanding about God as much as anything about nature. They were interested in looking at God, and sort of nature was a sort of a byproduct. So this is really a time before science. The Enlightenment, I suppose, was the start of the Enlightenment, but people are emerging from the Enlightenment. So he's got a foot in both camps. I suppose the Enlightenment, when you really come to think of it, a lot of these people concern themselves with the question of God. But here we go, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. He's a central figure of modern philosophy. He synthesized early modern rationalism and empiricism, set the terms for much of the 19th and 20th century philosophy, and continues to exercise a significant influence today in metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, political philosophy, aesthetics, and other fields. The fundamental ideas of Kant's, quote, critical philosophy, end quote, especially in his three critiques, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of the power of judgment, is human autonomy. He argues that the human understanding is the source of the general laws of nature that structure our experience, and that human reason gives itself the moral law, which is our basis for belief in God, freedom, and immortality. There you go. Therefore, scientific knowledge, morality, and religious belief are mutually consistent and secure because they all rest on the same foundation of human autonomy, which is also the final end of the nature according to the teleological worldview of reflecting judgment that Kant introduces to unify the theoretical and practical parts of his philosophical system. So teleological means cause-based. Everything is here for a reason. So this is really extending the basics of philosophy set up by Plato and Aristotle with his four causes. So teleo means the cause. So you can justify why something, or because that's what it wants to do. So he looks at the different causes. Now the Greeks had sort of things have internal causes. So you'll see a lot of the Greek philosophy coming out in the reading here. And so we're going to do number 1, the life and works. Prepare yourself for a whole lot of very long books and a sort of very German type of life. Section 1, Life and Works. This goes for about 50 pages, so we'll be here for a little while. Immanuel Kant was born on April 22, 1724 in Kronsberg, near the southeastern shore of the Baltic Sea. Today's Kronsberg has been renamed Kaliningrad and is part of Russia. But during Kant's lifetime, Kronsberg was the capital of East Prussia, and its dominant language was German, though geographically remote from the rest of Prussia and other German cities. Kronsberg was then a major commercial centre, an important military port, and a relatively cosmopolitan university town. Kant was born to an artisan family of modest means. His father was a master harness maker, and his mother was the daughter of a harness maker, though she was better educated than most women of her social class. Kant's family was never destitute, but his father's trade was in decline during Kant's youth, and his parents at times had to rely on extended family for financial support. Kant's parents were pietists. I'll explain, well, maybe it will be explained what a pietist is, but some sort of religious person. And he attended a pietist school, the Collegium Friederichium, from ages 8 to 15. Pietism was an evangelical Lutheran movement that emphasized conversion, reliance on divine grace, the experience of religious emotions, and personal devotion involving regular Bible study, prayer, and introspection. Kant reacted strongly against forced soul-searching to which he was subjected at the Collegium Fridericianum, in response to which he sought refuge in the Latin classics, which were central to the school's curriculum. Later, the mature Kant's emphasis on reason and autonomy rather than emotion and dependence on either authority or grace may in part reflect his useful reaction against pietism. But although the young Kant loathed the pietist schooling, he had deep respect and admiration for his parents, especially his mother, whose, quote, genuine religiosity, unquote, he described as, quote, not at all enthusiastic, unquote. Okay, so she wasn't a happy-clappy. According to his biographer, Manfred Kuhn, Kant's parents probably influenced him much less through their pietism than through their artisan values of, quote, hard work, honesty, cleanliness, and independence, close quote, which they taught him by example. And it's interesting that both Kant and Descartes really didn't like their school. They admired their school, took it on, but it pushed them in a different direction. So schools may not be perfect, but they do tend to have an effect. Kant attended the college at the University of Kronsberg, known as Albertina, where his early interest in the classics was quickly superseded by philosophy, which all first-year students studied, and which encompassed mathematics and physics, as well as logic, metaphysics, ethics, and natural law. Kant's philosophy professors exposed him to the approach of Christian Wolff, okay, there's another philosopher, whose critical synthesis of the philosophy of Leibniz was very influential in German university. So these people will take a different path from Descartes, which you've heard of before. Descartes he had the mind-body, I think, therefore I am. He tried to actually work how those two synthesize. These people are a different group. Kant was also exposed to a range of British critics of Wolff, and there were strong doses of Aristotelianism and pietism represented in the philosophy faculty as well. My God, I want to be a crazy faculty because these people would really believe these things. Kant's favourite teacher was Martin Nuttens, a pietist who was heavily influenced by both Wolff and the English philosopher John Locke. Once introduced Kant to the work of Isaac Newton, a hero, but remember that, so it's interesting on the two views of God and emotion that Newton had. Newton had absolute motion, which is sort of partially correct. And his influence is visible in Kant's first published work, Newton, and the work is called Thoughts on the True Estimation of Living Forces, which was a critical attempt to mediate a dispute in the natural philosophy between Leibnizians and Newtonians over proper measurement of force. Okay, so Leibniz, his school of Leibniz is really a co-inventor of calculus, also attributed to Newton. So Leibniz believed in, was able to think that there could only be relative motion. Leibniz was improving, both Leibniz and Newton improved on Cartesian laws of motion. So Newton didn't come up with the laws of motion out of the blue. They were in gradual development, starting off with Descartes. So Leibniz actually nailed more what momentum was. That momentum was a velocity at a direction, but he said there was no absolute motion, whereas Newton said, well, look, there has to be an absolute framework, which is in our critique by Einstein, because there's rotational absolute framework, so therefore there's a motional absolute framework. So it turns out that we're beginning to understand deeply now why there's a rotational framework. So I can be anywhere in the universe and I can tell you how fast I'm spinning relative to the rest of the universe by this force which pulls me out. So it's only in advanced physics now that we do understand why the rotational symmetry is different from the translational symmetry. Just talking on for a while. So Leibniz was actually closer to Einstein coming up, at least in my opinion, but he was way out. He looked at a bit of physics, but really got, as far as I'm concerned, really tied up with looking at God. Okay, back to the... I'll reread the last sentence. Thoughts on the true estimation of living forces, which was a critical attempt to mediate the dispute in natural philosophy between Leibnizians and Newtonians over proper measurement of force. So Newton believed in an absolute frame, and I think that's very much still taught in schools. After college, Kant spent 6 years as a private tutor to young children outside Kreuzberg. By this time, both of his parents had died, and Kant's finances were not yet secure enough for him to pursue an academic career. He finally returned to Kreuzberg in 1754 and began teaching at the Albertina the following year. For the next 4 decades, Kant taught philosophy there until his retirement from teaching in 1796, so he lived another 8 years at the age of 72, so he would have been nearly 80 when he died. Just a parallel of people going off to teach children. Priestley, I've forgotten his first name, the discoverer of oxygen, had a very sort of similar religious background story. Kant had a burst, he's a British person, Kant had a burst of publishing activity in the years after he returned from working as a private tutor. In 1754 and 55, he published 3 scientific works, one of which, here's a long title, Universal Natural History and the Theory of the Heavens, was a major book in which, among other things, he developed what later became known as the nebula hypothesis about the formation of the solar system. So that's an interesting aspect. Unfortunately, the printer went bankrupt and the book had little immediate impact. To secure qualifications for teaching at the university, Kant also wrote 2 Latin dissertations. The first, entitled, and wait for it, Consent's Outline of Some Reflections on Fire. That would be great reading in Latin. Earned him the Magister degree. And the second, New Elucidation of the First principles of metaphysical cognition. Wow. Entitled him to teach as an unsalaried lecturer. The following year he published another Latin work, the employment in the natural philosophy of metaphysics combined with geometry, continuing of which sample 1 contains the physical monadology, in the hopes of succeeding Kudzian, his favourite thing, as associate professor of logic and metaphysics, though Kant failed to secure the position. Okay, monadology. So the monad. So our very first philosopher came up with the monad symbol. So it's a dot. Monad. It means the first primal number, and that had evolved. So this is before Plato. He's got Pythagorean theory of numbers, the monad, and this sort of really goes into classical physics, point particles, the monads, and led to a different strand of philosophy. So Descartes was really talking about the mind-body duality. He had not a monad, he had a combination of things working together, mind and body, and separation, knowing it. Monads were more individual entities. It's hard for us to understand because we've got modern science to help us work things out. Back then there was this theory. So monads, that sort of goes along the idea of individual point particles and the atomists and stuff like that, whereas Descartes didn't believe in atoms, he believed in the continuity of matter. It's the monad theory and quantum mechanics don't go together too well. It's in my opinion, but I don't think very many quantum physicists look back and sort of compare their thought with ancient philosophy. Okay, continuing from there. So Kant tried to get his favourite teacher's position, but he failed. He mustn't have been a good political mover. Both the New Elucidation, which was Kant's first work, concerned mainly with metaphysics, and the physical monadology. Amazing. That would be so intractable to understand. Further develop the position on the interaction of finite substances, and that was first outlined in Living Forces, whatever that means. Both works depart from the Leibniz-Wolffian view, but not radically. So Leibniz was the competitor with Newton. He also came up with classical stuff, but he got deeply into monism and trying to work out your way to God. So they're all focusing on God, not really focusing on physics. I don't think they really thought physics was going to build atomic bombs or modify the world as much as it was going to. New elucidation, in particular, shows the influence of Christian August Crassus, a German critic of Wolff. This is complex. So Wolff was a German philosopher like Leibniz, who had this monad, which is from Pythagoras, which predates Plato. So Plato was a cause person, and so Plato and Aristotle were causes. You got their four causes, and things were doing things for a reason. So they hadn't really separated out law of things. They were getting confused between. I don't think they're confused. Oh, yes, I suppose confused between an argument about something and the actual physics of something. So your argument of something could actually influence the way in which a boulder falls down a hill. If you could argue your way out of a boulder falling down a hill on you. Okay, that's my view on it, at least. As an unsalaried lecturer at the Albertina, Kant was paid directly by the students who attended his lectures, so he needed to teach an enormous amount to attract many students in order to earn a living. In a certain sense, this is me doing podcasting to the world in general. I'm unsalaried. Kant held this position from 1755 to 70, that's 15 years, during which period he would lecture an average of 20 hours per week on logic, metaphysics, and ethics, as well as mathematics, physics, and physical geography. In his lectures, Kant used textbooks by Wolffian authors. So this is the probably quite good authors from the modernism, such as Alexander Gottlieb Bergengarten and George Frederick Meyer, famous people obviously, but he followed them loosely and used them to structure his own reflections, which drew a wide range of ideas from contemporary interest. These ideas often stemmed from British sentimentalist philosophers such as David Hume. We're going to have to do David Hume at some stage, and Francis Hutcheson, some of whose texts were translated into German by the mid-1750s, and from Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I've heard Rousseau heaps of things. I think Rousseau is... I'm trying to think of there's a philosopher quoted on the Brazilian flag who published a flurry of works in the early 1760s. From early in his career, Kant was a popular and successful lecturer. He also quickly developed a local reputation as a promising young intellectual and cut a dashing figure in Kreuzberg society. Well, there you go. It's nothing like overloading a person to really get them going. After several years of relative quiet, Kant unleashed another burst of publications from 1762 to 64, including 5 philosophical works. Here we go. The False, Subtlety of the 4 Syllogistic Figures. Whatever, that would be a fantastic book to read. Rehearses criticism of the Aristotelian logic that were developed by other German philosophers. The only possible... this is another quote. This is another book, and the book is called The Only Possible Argument in Support of a Demonstration of the Existence of God. Is a major book in which Kant drew on his earlier work in the and this is another book, Universal History and New Elucidation, to develop an original argument for God's existence as a condition of the internal possibility of all things, while criticizing the other arguments of God's existence. This really preoccupied all these people. Even Newton was involved thinking about God all the time. The book attracted several positive and some negative reviews, if anyone would have read it, I believe. In 1762, Kant also submitted an essay entitled, quote, this is it, Inquiry Concerning the Distinctness of the Principles of Natural Theology and Morality, to a prize competition at the Prussian Royal Academy. Though Kant's submission took second prize, this is all before Napoleon rips through all this place. Kant's submission took second prize to Moses Mendelssohn's, I don't think he's the composer's winning essay. It was co-published in 1764. Kant's prize essay, as is known, departs more significantly from the Leibniz-Wolffian views than his early work, and also contains his first extended discussion of moral philosophy in print. The prize essay draws on British sources to criticise German rationalism in 2 respects. First, drawing on Newton, Kant distinguishes between the methods of mathematics and philosophy. Leibniz is totally all over the place in that area. And the second, drawing on Hutchinson, he claims, quote, an unassailable feeling of good supplies the material content of our moral obligations, which cannot be demonstrated in a purely intellectual way from the formal principle of perfection alone. I find this interesting because I think this is probably a good critique of AI. So if AI cannot actually feel good, I can't see feel towards good. It's I don't know. If you read Kant, you get worried about artificial intelligence. I wonder what he'd think of them coming along. These themes reappear in, and this is another long one, attempt to introduce the concept of negative magnitudes in philosophy. That would be a great read, whose main thesis, however, is the real opposition of conflicting forces as causal relations. So that's what is teleological ideas, is not reducible to to the logical relation of contradictions as Leibnizians held. In negative magnitudes, Kant also argues that the morality of an action is a function of the internal forces that motivate one to act, rather than the external physical actions or their consequences. Finally, here's another big book written here. Observations on Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime deals mainly with the alleged differences in tastes of men and women and the people from different cultures. After it was published, Kant filled his own interleaved copy of this book with often unrelated handwritten remarks, many of which reflect the deep influence of Rousseau in the thinking about moral philosophy in the mid-1760s. So he got a book from the printer with every second page blank, I suppose. So every second page would be blank. You could probably ask for that if you wanted to take notes. There's an interesting aspect of it. I think there's beginning to get some Windows applications where you can write notes, but there's nothing like writing notes in a book, and it's very interesting. The philosophy of footnotes, just tracking out footnotes, Bruno keeping footnotes, various people keeping footnotes, is a very interesting aspect. That people do this, they write heaps of footnotes. And we, of course, wouldn't do that now because we've got library books and things like that. People would be very upset. These works helped to secure Kant's broader reputation in Germany, but for the most part they were not strikingly original. Like other German philosophers at his time, Kant's early works are generally concerned with using insights from British empiricist authors to reform and broaden the German rationalist tradition without radically undermining its foundations. Now, so a rationalist is someone who works things out in his head from first principles, and so the most famous rationalist of all time would have to be Einstein. So he developed his theories first by thought experiments, and then the empiricists came in after him. While some of his early works tend to emphasize rationalist ideas, others have a more empiricist basis. So this is your hypothesis disproving hypothesis. During this time, Kant was striving to work out an independent position, but before the 1770s, his views remained fluid. In 1766, Kant published his first work concerned with the possibility of metaphysics, which later became a central topic of his mature philosophy. And here's another, oh my God, Father, look at this title. Dreams of a Spirit Seer Elucidated by Dreams of Metaphysics. I'm going to read that one again. Dreams of a Spirit Seer Elucidated by Dreams of Metaphysics. Okay, what a fantastic book that would fly off the shelves, which he wrote soon after publishing a short essay on the maladies of the mind. I like maladies of the mind. You should read Francis Bacon. He really nails it. Quite entertaining to read Francis Bacon. Okay. Was occasioned by Kant's fascination with the Swedish visionary Emanuel Swedenborg. I suppose he'd have to be Swedish if he's got a name called Swedenborg, who claimed to have an insight into the spirit world that enabled him to make a series of apparently miraculous predictions. Oh, it sounds like someone on late night TV at the moment. In this curious work, Kant satirically compares Swedenborg's spirit visions to the belief of rationalist metaphysicians in an immaterial souls that survives death, and he concludes that philosophical knowledge of either is impossible because human reason is limited to experience. The skeptical tone of dreams is tempered, however, by Kant's suggestion that, quote, moral faith nevertheless supports belief in an immaterial, immortal soul, even if this is not possible to attain metaphysical knowledge in this domain. So you can see that he's rejected pietism, and it's actually gone to the end understanding that there is God, and is working out the sort of space between it. That's in my view. In 1770, at age 46, Kant was appointed to the chair of logic and metaphysics at the Albertina, after teaching for 15 years as an unsalaried lecturer and working since 1766 as sub-librarian to supplement his income. Sub-librarian. I should do a podcast on great librarians, because that would be a good one to do. There was a librarian anti-pope, a pope who was a librarian, but he wasn't considered a pope, he was considered an anti-pope. Fantastic thing. Okay, Kant was turned down for the same position in 1758. Oh, just good old 8 years waiting away. But later, as his reputation grew, he declined chairs in philosophy at Erlangen and Jena in hopes of obtaining one at Königsberg. After Kant was finally promoted, he gradually extended his repertoire of lectures to include anthropology. Kant was the first such course in Germany, and became very popular. Rational theology, pedagogy, natural light, and even mineralogy and military fortifications. Wow. In order to inaugurate his new position, Kant also wrote one more Latin dissertation. Okay, prepare yourself for a long title. Concerning the form and principles of the sensible and intelligible world. That's interesting. Okay, we'll try and look at the difference. He's obviously got two things about what do you make sense and what's intelligible, which is known as an inaugural dissertation. Okay, here we go into the inaugural dissertation. The inaugural dissertation departs more radically from both Wolffian rationalism and British sentimentalism than Kant's earlier work. That's going to take a lot of reading to understand. Inspired by Clausius and the Swiss natural philosopher Johann Hendrik Lambert, Kant distinguishes between two fundamental powers of cognition, sensibility and understanding, in quotes, intelligence. Where the Leibniz and Wolfson regarded understanding intellect as one fundamental power, Kant therefore rejects the rationalist view that sensibility is only a confused species of intellectual cognition. And he places this with his own view that sensibility is distinct from understanding and brings to perception its own subjective forms of space and time, a view that developed out of Kant's early criticism of Leibniz's relational view of space in, quote, this is a book, concerning the ultimate ground of the differentiation of directions in space. Moreover, as the title of the inaugural dissertation indicates, Kant argues that sensibility and understanding are directed in two different worlds. Sensibility gives us access to the sensible world, while understanding enables us to grasp a distinct intelligible world. These two worlds are related in that the understanding grasps the intelligent world is a paradigm of noumenal perfection, Noumenal perfection, which is a common measure of all other things insofar as they are realities. Considered theoretically, the intelligible paradigm of perfection is God. Considered practically, it's moral perfection. The inaugural dissertation thus develops from the Platoism, which is about forms, that God is a form, and that Platoism actually deals with God, that we're all parts of God, and rejects the view of the British sentimentalists that moral judgments are based on the feelings of pleasure and pain, which is to do with pleasure and pain was very much the medium of Descartes. Since Kant now holds that moral judgments are based on pure understanding alone. So I agree with him on that. After 1770, Kant, majority of people, morality is something that you don't talk about. I think maybe in general, I've never heard of a big boss sit down and talk about morality. That's all about their position. Okay, this keeps on going for a while. We're at 35 minutes. And we'll see how many more pages this goes for. Oh my god. After 1770, Kant never surrenders his view that sensibility and understanding are distinct powers of cognition, that space and time are subjective forms of human sensibility, and that moral judgments are based on pure understanding or reason alone. But its embrace of Platoism in the Inaugural Dissertation was short-lived. He soon denied that our understanding is capable of insight into an intelligible world, which cleared the path towards his mature position in the Critique of Pure Reason, according to which the understanding, like sensibility, supplies forms that structure our experience of the sensible world, to which human knowledge is limited, while intelligible or noumenal world is strictly unknowable to us, which is rather interesting. So he says that forms are generated inside the brain, according to this sentence at least. Kant spent a decade working on the Critique of Pure Reason, which published nothing else of significance between 1770 and 1781. This publication marked the beginning of another burst of activity that produced Kant's most important enduring works. Because early reviews of Critique of Pure Reason were few, and, in Kant's judgment, uncomprehending, he tried to clarify its main points in a much shorter, and I'll try and read this to you, prolegomena of any future metaphysics that will be able to come forward as a science. That's one book. Among the major books that rapidly followed were The Groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, Kant's main work on the fundamental principle of morality, The Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, his main work on natural philosophy, in what scholars call his critical period, 1781 to the end of his life, 1798, of his academic life. The second, a substantially revised edition of his Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and a fuller discussions of the topics in moral philosophy. It builds on and in some way revises the groundwork and the critique of the power of judgment, which deals with the aesthetics and theology as its cause. Kant also published a number of important essays in this period, including Idea for Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Aim, and, that's one book, Conjectural Beginnings of Human History, which main contribution to philosophy of history, which is his main contribution. Another book, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment?, which broaches some of the key ideas of his later political essays, and What Does It Mean to Orient Oneself in Thinking?, Kant's intervention in the pantheon of controversy that raged in the German intellectual circles after Jacobian, it might be the same, accused recently deceased Lessing and of Spinozism. So I know Spinozal decomposition, it's very interesting in terms of chemistry and stuff like that, but I'll have to, there's so many philosophers to go on, there's so much to pick up, and I suppose for me it's really interesting that people don't critique Newton, they love him so much. With the works of Kant secured international fame and came to dominate the German philosophy in the late 1780s. By 1790, he announced that his critique of power of judgment brought his critical enterprise to an end. By K.L. Reinhold, whose letters on the Kantian philosophy popularized Kant's moral and religious ideas, had been installed in the chair devoted to Kantian philosophy in Jena, which more centrally located than Kreuzberg and rapidly developing into a focal point of the next phase of German intellectual history. Reinzel soon began to criticise and move away from Kant's views. In 1794, his chair at Jena passed to Fichte, 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 otherwise the Germans pronounce the E at the end of it, who had visited the master in Kreuzberg and whose first book, quote, Attempt at the Critique of All Revelation, was published anonymously but initially mistaken for a work of Kant himself. This catapulted Fichte to fame, but he too soon moved away from Kant and developed an original position quite at odds with Kant's, which Kant finally repudiated publicly in 1799, the year after he retired, I think. Yet while German philosophy moved on to assess and respond to Kant's legacy, Kant himself continued publishing important works in the 1790s. Among them, these were Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, which drew censure from the Prussian king when Kant published the book after its second essay was rejected by a censor. The Prussians were in. The conflicts of the... You can imagine a censor reading this. Oh my God, this book. Too many people are going to read this book. The conflict of the faculties, a collection of essays inspired by Kant's troubles with the censor and dealing with the relationship between philosophical and theological faculties in the university. Oh my God. And then another book on the common saying, that may be correct in theory, but it is of no use in practice. Yeah, that little book. Towards the Perpetual Peace and the Doctrine of Right, the first part of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant's main works in political philosophy, called The Divine Virtue, the second part of Metaphysics of Morals, a catalogue of duties that Kant had been planning for more than 30 years, and The Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, based on Kant's anthropology lectures. Several other compilations of Kant's lecture notes from other courses were published later, but these were not prepared by Kant himself. Kant retired from teaching in 1796. For nearly 2 decades he lived a highly disciplined life, focused primarily on completing his philosophical system, which began to take definite shape in his mind only in middle age. After retiring, he came to believe that there was a gap in his system separating the metaphysical foundations of the natural sciences from physics itself, and he set out to close the gap in a series of notes that postulated the existence of ether and caloric matter. Oh, okay, so this would be Philestion, which is still around, 1796. It was probably the beginning of oxygen and modern chemistry. These notes, known as the Opus Postum, which means the final work, remained unfinished and unpublished in Kant's lifetime, and scholars disagree on their significance in relation to his early work. It is clear, however, that these late notes showed unmistakable signs of Kant's mental decline, which became tragically precipitous in 1800. Kant died in February in 1804, just short of his 80th birthday, so he was hit by dementia, I would expect. Okay, that finishes section 1, and it's gone for 43 minutes. Thanks a lot for listening. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.